Thrilled to be presenting a timely panel entitled COVID-19 and State and Local Financial Matters, sponsored by the ABA section of Civil Rights and Social Justice's Economic Justice Committee, as well as the State and Local Government Committee. This panel is one of many in a series of rapid response webinars on the COVID-19 pandemic. We are actively planning additional COVID-19 programming on a variety of issues, so please visit the website at americanbar.org/CRSJ for updates on all these programs. And don't hesitate to reach out if there's some program you'd like us to cover and you don't see it on the menu of options. During today's program, we encourage you to ask questions of our panelists. As an attendee, you should see a control panel with controls such as audio options, chat, raise hand, and Q&A. For the purposes of this webinar, we ask that you submit your questions through the Q&A. Do not use the chat function. Again, I'm going to say use the Q&A. Do not use the chat function. If you do not see these controls, please ensure your screen is not idle. We'll address questions at the end of the panel, and our panelists will also watch the Q&A to some extent and try to address the questions. But if they're not answered during the period of presentation, we will address them at the end. Please ensure that you do not use, one more time, the chat function. We will be sharing a recording of this program to everyone who's registered so that you can spread the news and share it widely with your networks. And the program recording will be online at the ABA CRSJ website. So don't hesitate to link to that website for others, and certainly tweet it, please. Please feel free to leave us feedback or ask questions to follow up. And with that, we're thrilled to bring you today's program. I first want to introduce our panelists, and I have to tell you, I am always thrilled to bring together top experts, literally international experts in this area, to join you and to give you their wisdom from across the country. And when I mentioned that it's the American Bar Association, Civil Rights and Social Justice, I can tell you that people are enthusiastic to participate. So that's a big shout out to this organization. Our panelists today are truly the best of the best, experts in this field, and we are so fortunate that they're coming together, all three of them, literally, to give you a perspective. We're going to start off with the big picture and then narrow down. So I'm introducing the panelists. I'm going to introduce them in order of presentation. Matthew Fiedler is a fellow of Economic Studies, USC Brookings Schaefer Initiative for Health Policy. Matthew, prior to joining Brookings, was the chief economist of the Council of Economic Advisors. He oversaw the council's work on healthcare policy. And if you can imagine what a heavy lift this was, he worked on implementation of the Affordable Care Act's health insurance expansions and healthcare delivery systems. He is an economist with a PhD from Harvard. He is BAs in mathematics, and so he's a critical thinker who can also do deep dives into the numbers and also speak to policy. So we are very fortunate to have him. After Matthew, we're going to have Elaine Mogg. Elaine is a frontline passion warrior for tax justice. She is a principal research associate with Urban Institute. She also works with the Tax Policy Institute. She has written extensively, and I encourage you to go online and see her prolific writings. She writes critically about economic justice for children and families, and is a big advocate of refundable credits to lift working poor families, and especially targeting poverty, anti-poverty relief delivered through the tax system. Elaine, I've been on several panels with Elaine, and she is not only a wonderful speaker and writer, but she has at her fingertips technical data that that they are able to, at Urban, give states and local governments, as well as the federal government, tools to think critically about different remedies to critical problems that our world has faced. So we are very fortunate to have Elaine. And last, but certainly not least, Lisa Christensen-Gee, who is Director of Special Initiatives for the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy. And once again, this nonprofit organization is a phenomenal resource and repository of data. And what I really appreciate about ITEP, which is the acronym, is that ITEP does critical analysis on a state-by-state basis. And so I encourage you to go to their website, and it's itep.org. They have a plethora of information on all 50 states, plus Washington, D.C., and they analyze on a regular basis how the tax systems for each state works and doesn't work. And they have many tools and resources to think more critically about how states, as well as the federal government, can do better with respect to taxation and economic policy. All of these individuals are not only brilliant minds and critical thinkers, but they are also wonderful people who are generous with their time and their energy and truly want to lift all of us up and help everyone deal with this unprecedented economic and healthcare crisis. I am Francine Lipman. I am a William S. Boyd Professor of Law at UNLV. I also have the privilege of serving Nevada as a Nevada Tax Commissioner, but I do want to just say that everything I say today is as in my role as an individual and passion warrior for tax justice. And with that, I'm delighted to turn the panel over to Matthew Fiedler, and thank you so much.
Great. Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction, and I'm really very honored to be here today and looking forward to the other panelists' presentations and to the questions that you all will have. So I wanted to, as Francine suggested, I want to start out a little bit with the big picture, taking a look at, where the fiscal pressures on states coming from, how large should we expect them to be, and how much, and if the federal government were to step in to provide aid to states to try to offset some of those pressures, how might it think about doing that? So just to start off, I think there are three basic things that are putting pressure on state governments at the moment. One is that they're incurring substantial costs associated with the direct response to COVID-19. So, state and local public health departments are responsible for contact tracing. States have been playing a substantial role in procuring ventilators and personal protective equipment for hospitals. There are a variety of other direct costs associated with COVID-19 that state governments are bearing. A second component, which is probably the largest of these three components, is that the economic fallout from COVID-19, as people lose their jobs or are staying home and not going to the store to make purchases, or is putting downward pressure on income tax revenues and sales tax revenues. And then the third component is that, again, as people lose their jobs and their incomes fall, more people are becoming eligible for Medicaid, which increases states' costs for that program. And there are a variety of other programs, targeted to low-income families that are going to be experiencing increased burdens in the coming months and probably years. So the challenge that this creates for state governments is most state governments are required to balance their budgets. And while states actually came in with unusually large rainy day funds heading into this economic downturn, they're far smaller than the budget shortfalls states are likely to face. So they're gonna, in the months and years ahead, face some hard choices. They're either gonna need to cut what they're spending on programs, or they're gonna increase taxes. In past downturns, what we've seen is that the bulk of the adjustment has happened on the spending side of state budgets. So states have raised taxes to some degree. But when states cut spending, that means that various state services that spending was supporting are no longer being delivered. The bulk of what states are spend money on is education, healthcare, and transportation. So as well as all the other various functions of government. So as states make those cuts, those areas are going to cease providing the level of service that state residents may be accustomed to. There's a second set of effects that any of the state responses, whether it's cutting spending or increasing taxes, will have is, when you cut spending, that reduces salary incomes for state workers and for states contractors, and those people are in turn going to then reduce their spending on other goods and services, which is going to sort of deepen the downturn and slow the recovery from the recession. Increasing taxes probably has some similar effects, so I think there's reason to believe that if you had to choose between cutting spending and increasing taxes from a macroeconomic perspective, states would be better off raising taxes. And I suspect Lisa may speak to that point a little bit later. So that's where the pressures are coming from. How big should we expect these pressures to be? So one way of getting at that question is to look at what we've seen in past economic downturns. So what I'm showing you here is a scatter plot of the year-over-year change in the national unemployment rate against the real per capita revenues collected by state governments. And what we can see is that the periods that have seen substantial increases in unemployment have also seen large reductions in state tax revenues. If you run a regression based on these data, you conclude that a 1 percentage point increase in unemployment has historically been associated with about a 3.7% decline in real per capita state revenues. So what does that mean in dollar terms? So if you apply that 3.7% to the current level of state tax revenues, you conclude that each percentage point on an increase in unemployment is going to cost states about $41 billion in revenue per year. As I mentioned, that's not the only source of pressure on state governments from higher unemployment. Higher unemployment is also likely to be associated with increased enrollment in Medicaid and higher demands on other programs. And if you make some allowances for those pressures as well, you're probably looking at something like $45 billion in pressure on state governments on an annual basis for each percentage point that the unemployment rate rises. I'll note that this is before you even start thinking about the direct costs associated with the COVID-19 response. So if you added those in, this number would be somewhat larger. So what does that mean for the aggregate shortfall states are likely to face? So what I'm showing you here are just two projections of unemployment over the next few years. one from the Congressional Budget Office and one from the private economic forecasting team at Goldman Sachs. These are obviously not the only two unemployment forecasts out there, but they are two prominent ones. The first thing to note is that unemployment is expected to rise very substantially over the near term to 15% or more when it peaks the second quarter, in the third quarter of this year. That's a level of unemployment that's higher than anything the US has seen since the Great Depression. I think the other thing to note is while unemployment does bounce back sharply after the peak, it's going to be a long time, at least in these forecasts, before unemployment is back to the levels we were at before the crisis. So that suggests that the period that state budgets are likely to be under strain is going to be an extended one. Also note, and I want to return to this point later, that just how quickly unemployment comes back down is a matter of substantial disagreement between these two forecasters, but also among economic forecasters more generally. And I think that has some implications for how one should think about designing state fiscal relief. So if you combine those paths of unemployment with the $45 billion per point of unemployment rule of thumb I talked about a little bit earlier, you can get some estimates of what state budget shortfalls are likely to look like over the next few years. So what I've done here is just say, take the actual unemployment rate being forecast by these forecasters, compare it to the 3.5% unemployment rate we were at before the downturn started, and multiply that by 45 billion, what do you come up with? What you see under the CBO projections is you're talking about cumulative state budget shortfalls on the order of $900 billion over the fiscal years through 2023. That number is somewhat smaller under the Goldman Sachs projections because they have unemployment coming down more quickly, but you're still talking about almost $600 billion. So, you know, the pressures that states are going to face are going to be very substantial. So if, in light of these pressures, if you know, the goal was to keep states from having to make the damaging cuts to state programs or implement tax increases during this period, how would you go about doing that? Thankfully, the federal government is able to borrow, unlike states, and the federal government is able to borrow right now at quite low interest rates. So there's sort of an obvious solution that the federal government could borrow funds and transfer those funds to the states and avoid states having to make these damaging policy changes. So Congress has taken some tentative steps in that direction so far. The first step was in the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, which sometimes is called the Phase 2 COVID legislation, implemented a 6.2 percentage point increase in the federal Medicaid matching rate. That probably translates to about $40 billion a year for state governments as long as it remains in effect. It will remain in effect until the end of the federal public health emergency. It's unclear how long that will go on. So this could be a year, this could be 2 years, it could be more than that. I think we don't exactly know. The CARES Act, or what's sometimes called the Phase 3 COVID-19 legislation, included some additional funds for state and local governments. The challenge with many of those funds is, unlike the Medicaid matching funds, which are basically fungible, while they're delivered through Medicaid, they can effectively be used to respond to revenue shortfalls or other pressures on state governments. Many of the funds included in the CARES Act were more restricted. So for example, the CARES Act included this $150 billion coronavirus relief fund. That, at least in principle, was only available to states to incur costs, to cover costs directly related to COVID-19. And so it's not available to meet these sort of broader fiscal pressures arising from the economic downturn. I think there's a question in practice whether states will be able to nevertheless find ways to use some of these funds to respond to broader fiscal pressures, but these dollars are not fully fungible. Many of the other pots of money I'm showing on this slide are similarly restricted. So for example, the Education Stabilization Fund includes a maintenance of effort requirement that, unless waived by the Department of Education, will keep states from cutting their own spending on education in order to use these dollars to respond to other pressures. all told, if you make assumptions about, how long is the additional Medicaid funding going to last in practice, and how fungible are these other dollars, I think you can convince yourself that maybe there's as much as $200 billion here for states, but probably it's quite a bit less than that. And I think it's easy to believe that, in fact, states will only end up with about $100 billion that they can really use to meet the broader fiscal pressures we're talking about from higher unemployment and lower economic activity. So in my view, that means there is, given that 100, or even on the outside in the optimistic case, a couple $100 billion in state fiscal relief is much smaller than those $600 or $900 billion shortfalls we were talking about on the prior slide. I think there's a strong argument that the federal government should be providing additional aid to states in the coming weeks and months. What should that state fiscal relief look like? I think there are 3 principles that I would lay out. First is that it should be consistent with the size of the problem that states are facing. So if states are facing $600 billion or $900 billion shortfalls, and we've only provided 100 or 200 billion of aid to date, then we should be talking about several hundred billion more in additional federal aid to states that pays out over the next few years. So the second point that I think is worth keeping in mind is that we don't know exactly how high unemployment is going to go or how fast unemployment is going to come down once we hit the peak. And depending, and just illustrating that with the projections I was talking about earlier, the scenarios where unemployment peaks higher and falls slower are scenarios where states are going to be facing much more intense fiscal pressure. And so well-designed federal aid should provide more assistance in those states of the world so that states don't have to take adverse steps in those circumstances. Those are probably also situations where the sort of macroeconomic benefits of additional aid are particularly large. So that implies, again, that any aid that the federal government does provide, in principle at least, should be larger in amount if an unemployment goes higher, and should last longer if unemployment stays higher for longer. There's another dimension of this that probably actually should have been a 4th principle on my slides, but obviously different states are going to face different downturns that are more intense or less intense than others. And so, ideally a formula, in addition to basing the amount of assistance that in aggregate nationwide that goes out based on how long and how deep this downturn are, the amount of assistance any individual state receives should ideally be tied to what the economic conditions in that state are. How high does unemployment go in that state, and how long does unemployment stay high? And then the third criterion I would highlight is that ideally federal aid should be designed particularly to encourage states to protect low-income people and Medicaid in particular. States are going to be facing lots of difficult choices, and they're going to have to cut lots of things that without enough aid, they're going to have to cut lots of things that produce lots of value for state residents. But I think it's particularly important, particularly in the midst of a pandemic, to ensure that we protect programs that provide healthcare to low-income people and people with disabilities. So there are a lot of different ways that if federal policymakers want to deliver aid in accordance with these types of principles, that they could go about doing it. And I think it's really important that the perfect not be the enemy of the good here. Any money that the federal government can get out the door to states during this period would be incredibly valuable. But I do want to talk about one approach that I've written about in the past with some co-authors, with Jason Furman, who was my boss at the Council of Economic Advisors, and Willie Powell, who was also a colleague of ours at CEA. Under the approach we put forward, the share of a state's Medicaid program that was financed by the federal government would increase based on the state's unemployment rate. So the size of that increase would be based on the number of percentage points a state's unemployment rate exceeded a threshold level, and then you'd multiply that amount of excess unemployment based on some number of percentage points. I've put 7 percentage points here, but you could dial that up or down depending on how much assistance you wanted to deliver and what other mechanisms might be being used to deliver assistance to state governments. And the threshold under our proposal would be the 20th percentile of state unemployment rates of the prior 15 years plus 1 percentage point. What this is basically supposed to be is the level, the 20th percentile is supposed to approximate what reflects sort of full employment in a state, and then the 1 percentage point offers some margin for fluctuations around that. And the benefit of this proposal, relative to these principles would be threefold. If that 7 percentage points or whatever it is set at the right level, this assistance would scale and match the size of the problem. It would adjust automatically based on the length and duration of the downturn. So, even if future Congress didn't want to provide additional fiscal relief, that would happen automatically through this type of proposal. And because it would deliver assistance by increasing the matching rate under Medicaid, it would particularly discourage states from implementing cuts to their Medicaid programs during this period, which, as I mentioned earlier, I think has particularly high value. And as go back to the sort of fourth principle that should have been on here, because the amount of the increase in each state's matching rate would be based on unemployment in that state, it would tailor assistance effectively to each state's economic conditions. So just to conclude, I think the evidence we have so far, and given what the economic outlook looks like, states are likely to face very large budget shortfalls. I expect that those will be at least $500 billion through fiscal year 2023. And I think there are easily scenarios where you can come up with where they're pushing $1 trillion over that time period. The federal aid that has been provided to date offsets only a fairly small portion of those shortfalls. I think talking about maybe 200 billion, but I think quite plausibly a decent amount less than that. And so I think federal policymakers should be thinking about providing additional aid to states in the coming weeks and months. A well-designed aid package should be large enough to match the size of the problem. It should adjust with the economic outlook, and it should protect Medicaid to the extent possible. So in any case, I look forward to the other presentations, and I look forward to all of your questions. Thanks very much for having me.
Matthew, just a quick question before we transition.
Yep.
So many folks have talked about deficits. Obviously, federal government helping the states, especially states who have to balance their budgets. What are your thoughts about federal deficits?
So I think federal deficits are just not a first order policy concern at the moment. Interest rates are incredibly low, and the return to federal deficit spending in terms of greater economic activity are incredibly high. And so the right thing for the federal government to be doing right now is to be running large deficits, to provide aid to states, to provide aid to people who are unemployed, to fund the response to COVID-19. Over the very long run, does the federal government have a deficit problem? Yes, and there may be policies we want to implement over the long run to deal with that problem, but it is not my first, second, third, or fourth policy priority for federal policy at the moment.
Excellent, and I would say that this is consistent with dealing with the Great Recession.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think one of the things we saw following the Great Recession was a premature pivot to concerns about deficits rather than continuing to provide fiscal assistance to the economy when it was weak. So, I think that there are important lessons to be learned from the experience during the Great Recession.
Exactly. Thank you so much. And now we're going to, so that was wonderful, Matthew. Lots of data, lots of information. Now we're going to transition to Elaine Mogg. Thank you, Elaine.
Thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. Excuse me? Oh, so thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. I was thinking as I was preparing, last week, my kids were kind of running around the house, and there was a representative that was going to be on the Zoom meeting. So I said, oh my gosh, you got to come here and see this. And we were all joking in the conference, like, oh, it's Take Your Kid to Zoom Day. So if anyone out there has also taken their kid to Zoom today, welcome. I will say my children generally think they're getting the short end of the stick in this stay-at-home thing, because they are learning a lot about tax policy while they are providing all this technical assistance for me, because I'm not very good at the computer business. But we're all muddling through, and I am so excited to be here today, because although my children think tax policy is not the most fascinating thing, I do. I just think the power of the tax system is underrated. And I'm so thrilled to be with Francine, because she is just waving the red flags about real troubles are ahead if we don't act in a very thoughtful manner. So although most of my work is at the federal level, I have done work in the past on how states support low-income families and how tax and transfer programs at the state and federal level fit together, and how states can prepare or not prepare for problems that seem to always loom. This presentation draws heavily on work done by my colleagues in the State and Local Finance Initiative and others in the Tax Policy Center, as well as some outside organizations. Matt just did such a wonderful job of showing how big this hole is, and some really key ways on how this hole is not going to get smaller, and people are going to continue to suffer in this near term. So what I want to do is sort of make the case that this is just out of left field, what we are experiencing right now. And states were actually quite prepared coming into this recession. And I think that's important, because I hear lots of arguments out there about how states created this problem and why should the federal government help. So I'm going to try to fill in some holes there. States have absolutely been saving, and they face real limits that are both statutory and political in nature in what they can do. And what they are experiencing now is absolutely something they cannot shoulder on their own without causing additional problems or slowing the eventual recovery. In fact, I would argue if there was an irresponsible partner in this union, it was the federal government, who was digging deeper and deeper holes during times of expansion. So I asked the question, generally, were states ready for this downturn? And I want to try and weave in why states being ready was important. And it's because states really matter for low and middle income families. So the big thing is what was just being pointed out, that unlike the federal government, which is not required to balance its budget, most states must do some sort of budget balancing, and that sort of sets up the issue. So balanced budget requirements prohibit states from spending more than they collect in revenue. And these requirements do vary in stringency and design. So there's 46 states and the District of Columbia that must in some way balance their budget. Some states have pretty lenient balanced budget requirements that only require governors to propose a balanced budget. Stricter balanced budget requirements say that a balanced budget actually has to be enacted. And then sometimes that applies to operating budgets, sometimes it applies to more of the budget. But in 44 states and the District of Columbia, the governor must propose a balanced budget to the legislature. And in 41 states in DC, the legislature must actually pass a balanced budget. And in 40 states, the governor must ultimately sign a balanced budget. And those are the states that you see in blue here. States combine these rules differently, and the rules vary, but the spirit is still that they're not digging giant holes in certainly their general revenues year over year. So 8 states, those pink states on this map, do have permission to carry over some deficit, and that allows them to plug unexpected budget gaps with reserve funds or to address them in the following fiscal year. So sometimes what they have are these funds that can help in lean times. And I would argue that those funds were quite robust coming into this. But there's sort of two pieces to this. There's how states actually get money and how states spend their money. And I want to focus just a little bit of time on that so that to put into context, you know, Matt's comments about there being two ways that states can handle this. So on the revenue side, you can see that these are sort of what's happening in a normal year, not what I anticipate to be happening in 2020. But intergovernmental transfers are very important to states, and they account for about 1/3 of all general revenues. But more important to this conversation, the other items are ways that states can raise revenue outside of looking to the federal government, and all of these are going to be impacted. Sales tax have taken a huge hit. People are staying home more, and while they're still purchasing necessities, they're not likely purchasing non-essential items. And this is driven both because people have already seen their incomes cut or because they fear their incomes being cut, which naturally causes people to stop spending or spend less, but also because stores they shop at are shuttered and they're instructed to stay safer at home. And so this is going to absolutely affect sales taxes. And while I expect that some purchases are being delayed and we'll pick up those revenues later, a lot of those purchases are not being delayed, they're simply being skipped. States also get money from charges and miscellaneous funds. So those include things like entrance fees into parks and toll roads, also totally plummeting. Then there's individual income taxes, which states draw on a lot, but interestingly, states are quite different in their ability to press this lever. So some states are composed of populations with a few high income people that maybe you could ask to pony up now, but some states really don't have a lot of high income people. They're full of people that are largely being impacted by the pandemic happening right now. So as people are losing jobs, they're also not having to pay taxes on those lost revenues. So that's going to impact states. And then there's other taxes. So I don't really see a world in which we don't anticipate radical drops to all of these revenue streams. States do have rainy day funds, and these are sort of interesting funds that states hold. But in 31 states, there are caps to the amount of money that can be held in the fund. So they could not have prepared more than they did for this recession. There's often a lot of pressure on these funds as well because legislators want to deliver services or tax cuts to their constituents. And particularly when you're in a state with a time-limited legislature, their window of when they think about policy can be very shrunk. So it's kind of remarkable that despite all of these restrictions, Pew released a study, and this picture is from them, just before this crisis came really slamming down, reporting the following. For the 9th straight year, states had increased their rainy day funds or budget stabilization funds. States had enough money in these funds that they could now operate for almost 28 days, compared with about 17 before the last recession hit. So relative to the last time states were in trouble, they were quite prepared. Moreover, state spending was not at extremely high levels. Overall, state spending had just returned to 2008 peaks. So all of that information together would have led me to say states are on solid ground and they are ready for the next recession that's going to come. And I guess all I can say now is sort of a Yogi Berra quote that predictions are hard, especially about the future. In the state tax world, states had done an impressive job also of trying to make state taxes more fair for low-income families. And they did this by building on a federal anti-poverty program, which is the Earned Income Tax Credit, which essentially provides a credit that you can get beyond how much tax you owe in most cases if you're a low or middle income worker. And most of these credits go to families with children. So since the last recession, states had been adding on to their earned income tax credits. And you can see it's sort of all over the country. It's not in just one area. So why do I worry when I think about state spending being cut, which I agree is the likely response that states will have in this recession? This chart shows how states spend their money. They spend about a fifth of it on public welfare. They spend about a fifth of it on elementary and secondary education. They spend 10% on higher education, health and hospitals, and then there's some smaller categories. I will point out here that I've seen in the news a lot of discussion about pension funds and how they're driving this problem. It's just simply not true. While pension funding is an important part of state budgets, it's not the driver of any of these categories of spending. It's not the major one. And what states are facing now is not huge increases in pension liabilities, but significant declines in revenues. That's the focus here. So when I look across this state spending, I think most of these categories are likely to go up in the pandemic we have right now, not down. So schools are closed in many places, and elementary and secondary schools will feel a lot of pressure when they finally can come back in person to catch up to students. Typically, we see lots of summer slide during those 3 months that students vacation typically, and that gap is likely going to be much greater. So in an ideal education policy world, we would think about adding staff to try to assist closing this gap that we know is coming. So that pressure is going to be large, although I think mostly unmet. But basically all of these categories get bigger during this time. On top of that, states have new demands. So the federal government has to date sort of not really come up with a good paid sick leave policy or a family leave policy. Several states have their own policies, and those states are absolutely going to face more pressure on those systems. As long as schools are closed, as long as childcare centers are closed, there are people which have significant caregiving responsibilities that will need to be offset, hopefully some sort of relief. It's also because this pandemic is coming with a health side to it, we can expect there will be demands for paid sick leave. Healthcare costs, as Matt mentioned, associated with the virus are going to rise. There's going to be increased Medicaid enrollment associated with recession. And of course, unemployment is going up and states shoulder a share of that as well. So there's all these existing things states spend money on, and now there are new demands as well. And my argument would be is we just cannot let the states solve this problem on their own, because as mentioned before, what states can do left to their own devices are increase taxes and decrease spending. And there is simply not a magic bullet out there of untaxed income that it would make sense for states to just adjust and go grab. And decreasing spending will almost surely cause this recession and its all the problems that are coming with it to just get even greater, because we'll be spending less on exactly the things we need to spend more on. So I am very much looking forward to Lisa's talk, where she'll describe what states can do.
Thank you, Elaine. We have a couple questions that I'm going to ask maybe both you and Lisa to answer. And so Marilyn Harbour, who is the chair of the Economic Justice Committee, has asked, are the state and local pension costs included in your bar graph percentages for education and police?
They are, but it's about 5% of state budgets. So it's just not a huge piece of the story right now. It is something that states need to deal with. Like they need to cut spending or raise revenues and get these things back in balance, but now is not the time to do that. And I would argue that states were making significant steps in many cases to, shore up this sort of well-known issue.
Excellent. Now, another question that we're seeing again and again, as you indicated on your slides, many states have a balanced budget requirement. Do our panelists think that this might be something that should be amended for these states?
So I guess my feeling is we have a federal system where the federal government should be in charge of sort of these big problems and surprises that come along. They're always going to have deeper pockets than states. And then the states should be in charge of sort of understanding what their constituents need and how best to solve problems. I don't think getting rid of balanced budget requirements wholesale is necessarily a good idea. I can see relaxing them a bit, or sort of requiring, bigger rainy day funds, but I'm not sure I would get rid of them all. Simply, they don't have the policy levers to dig out of holes the same way that the federal government does.
Excellent. And I think COVID-19, as compared to almost any other disaster, other than, I guess, our most recent example is the Great Recession. And as Matt and you have indicated, this overwhelms that and really is more comparable to the Great Depression. Federalism is important, and there are different roles between the states and the federal government. And we are seeing that play out live, literally on a daily basis, to see that the federal government has a role that's very different than the state governments. And that's part of the design of our, the United States.
Right, so a great example of that is, how we run unemployment insurance, where states are ultimately paying, the bills, but the federal government is sort of serving as a backstop to, lend money and make sure the system is whole when the states are in trouble, and then helping the states kind of dig out as unemployment is being relied on less. So to me, that's a partnership that makes sense, but I'm interested in other people's thoughts too.
Okay, Lisa, thank you so much. We're looking forward to hearing more of a kind of a deep dive into, focusing on state and local issues and what they can do and what they have done.
Yeah.
What they will do.
Yes, thank you, Francine, and thank you for all the great context that's been built by Matthew and Elaine. So I think what's clear is that we know that COVID-19, the effect on public health and economies is going to create this very daunting situation for state and local budgets. And part of what's challenging is that it's hard to even know the scale of that right now, right? I was talking with someone who's responsible for doing the fiscal estimates in the District of Columbia, and they basically said, well, I have no idea. the problem is that the data isn't coming in yet. The change was so swift, so rapid, that the data, hasn't caught up yet. And further, many states have responded, at least initially, by extending their tax deadlines for both income taxes and sales taxes, which has made it difficult as well to kind of gauge what the real and full effect of the fiscal crisis that we're facing is in the moment. These are some initial estimates that the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities has put together. It gives you a survey of a few states, and the highlighted column is showing you some preliminary estimates of general revenue fund declines, right? So we have on sort of the higher end, early estimates showing that states like Illinois might be facing between 11 and 35% hit to their general fund budgets. You see New Mexico is between 20 and 27%. We're doing a lot of modeling right now in various states where we are estimating between 10 and 40% losses. It's really unknown at the moment, but we know that even on the low end, it's going to be a challenge for states and localities to figure out what to do. As Matt mentioned, that the full scale, when you look across the states, might be between 500 billion. The Center on Budget and Policy Priorities right now is estimating 650 billion, up to $1 trillion. And you can just see how this sort of compares to what we saw in both the Great Recession and then prior to that with the dot-com bubble. So you can see that this is much more intense, much larger in magnitude than even in the Great Recession. So a really challenging moment for states. And as has been indicated, even if the states were to take their very well-funded rainy day funds and utilize all of that funding towards plugging budget holes, and then use the state aid that has been given to them by the federal government without increasing much more substantial federal aid, states will still be left with significant holes that they will have to fill through cuts, tax increases, or some combination thereof. And what that means, a lot of that, what are states going to do and how problematic might revenue raising be for both economic recovery as well as the impact that those tax choices have on individual taxpayers at different income levels or different race and ethnicities, in large part depends on the taxing authority and the composition of the tax base that states and local governments rely on. So these pie charts just show you sort of on average for across the 50 states. At the state level, we know that about a third of revenues are coming from income taxes, personal income taxes, and then an equally or slightly smaller share is coming from general sales taxes at the state level. And then at the local level, there's a heavier reliance on property taxes, non-tax sources such as licenses, fees, fines, et cetera. And then not as high, but still some pretty, relatively a significant portion of their total budgets from general sales tax revenues. So at a moment where we know that consumer spending has been shocked greatly, that's going to pose a problem for states. We know, for example, just a snapshot from just New York City, they were able to put out a recent estimate in April compared to what they were expecting going into the new year. You see sort of these different tax bases are expected to be hit disproportionately, with the general sales tax being the most heavily impacted. And again, these are still numbers that are made without complete and full information, but we have a clear sense that general sales tax revenues are going to be much harder hit, which means that states that rely more heavily on those revenues are going to find themselves in more challenging situations. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on sort of the profile of who is cutting back spending, leading to some of these declines in sales and consumption, but you can return back to that as you review the slides on your own. What we do know is that from surveys of consumers that McKinsey has put out, that close to half of all consumers have, pretty significantly cut back on their spending, which is significant. And then when you look at some information about what are the intentions of consumers, right? Even if and when the shelter-in-place orders are lifted, businesses are reopening, how quickly might they bounce back or return to their previous spending, you see that there's a decline, there's a tentativeness, right, to spend in the same way and on the same things. In terms of the states that are going to be particularly hit by this decline in the sales tax, you'll see Nevada, sorry, Francine, they rely, almost half of their total state revenues are from the sales tax. So and also states like Washington, Florida, other states that don't have personal income taxes are going to be more heavily feeling this and lacking tools that will help them kind of fill in any part of the hole that they need to, that's not going to be met from rainy day funds, federal aid, or budget cuts. So before we dive into what some of the tax or revenue raising options might exist and why some of those options are going to be more advantageous or preferable than others, I want to be clear that we share, sort of the same sense of the order in which these budget holes should be filled and how they should be addressed. And the first is absolutely that there needs to be much more significant and flexible federal fiscal aid, right? That gives states broad leverage to be able to fill budget holes and spending according to their own judgment calls as to when and where that is needed. States should definitely be tapping into their rainy day funds. We know that early on, we saw states even with some robust rainy day funds reluctant to tap into those because of concerns over how it might affect their bond ratings. Thirdly, we think the next thing to do is to really look at what revenue raising state or local government has available to them, particularly if they have tax bases that allow them to raise that revenue in a progressive fashion, meaning where those with higher incomes would be bearing more of the tax increase than those with lower incomes. Other principles that we think are important include thinking about how coronavirus relief funds can also make sure that they're going to the highest priority services for those in most need, provide aid to local entities to give them greater flexibility to raise revenues, right? Local governments are children of the state, right? And many of them rely entirely on states to give them authority to have their own revenue raising options, which can be really hard in moments like this if they don't have many options available to them. And then finally, we really do think that budget cuts should be a last resort and not a first action item as a matter of economic policy and tax policy, even though we understand that the politics of the way that these things go down, it's often the case that budget cuts will be the first thing that many states go to, which we see just in the last couple of weeks as states are getting revised revenue impact statements or projections. We know that already Oklahoma, Georgia, North Dakota are being asked to come up with, the agencies are being asked to come up with budget cuts, the magnitude between 5 and 15%. Texas, Connecticut, and Pennsylvania just got really sobering news on their own fiscal outlooks, and we anticipate that that will continue to be the case for more states as more data is available to them and as their legislatures start reconvening, as they've also been practicing social distance, many of them. So when it comes to actually thinking about some tax increases or raising revenue, before we go into some specific levers that are available or specific policies, I want to touch on just a couple of guiding principles. And those apply specifically to this moment, right? The first is to follow the money, right? That states, in thinking about what sort of new tax might be levied to generate needed revenue, should think about following, what are the households, the businesses, the sectors of the economy that are still, even in this moment of crisis, maintaining or even experiencing higher incomes and profits and activity, even in this moment of troubled times. So for states that are facing, catastrophic revenue declines, asking more from taxpayers with a clear ability to pay is much preferable to cutting budgets, which would lead to mass layoffs, steep cuts in public services and a downward spiral in the economy. So as unemployment is high and aggregate demand continues to be low, we think that progressive tax raising options are the far better option for just the economy and the hope of recovery overall. This also speaks to the value and the benefit of having progressive revenue raising options as part of a state's composition overall, right? Because a state, if it has a progressive income tax where it levies different rates for higher levels of income, it is able to enact tax increases on a subset of taxpayers according to that is responsive to those who have capacity at this moment of crisis and need. And states that don't have that capacity are left with really awful choices. The second principle is thinking about combining shovel-ready reforms with those options that will lay new foundations for stronger and more sustainable tax systems going forward, right? So in the, according to the adage of, never waste a good crisis, right? Now is a moment to not only for states or local governments looking to raise revenue, to not just say, what is the thing that we could act, most quickly or most easily, politically speaking. It's an opportunity to say, what are the changes that we've known that we've needed to make, whether it has to do with broadening sales and modernizing sales tax bases, paving the path for more progressive revenue options that might have otherwise faced a harder political or enactment fight. This is an opportunity to kind of think about whether there's opportunities to lay some groundwork for a stronger tax system going forward. Third principle is when you're in a hole to stop digging. Similar to the federal government and with the enactment of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act back in December of 2017, many states have also really kind of gotten on this bandwagon on cutting taxes, particularly for individuals with higher incomes and for businesses. And so one, principle is really at this moment to reevaluate those. So some states, for example, have enacted tax cuts that have not gone into effect yet. So now is an opportunity to push pause on the enactment or the timing of the enactment of those planned tax cuts. Also for states where maybe a tax cut has gone into effect, but it hasn't had its full effect for the first full fiscal year or tax year, that might be an opportunity to retroactively put that on pause, to stop that, just to evaluate what might be happening. We know some states are not doing this. So Arkansas had a tax cut for income earners making over $75,000. That was scheduled to go into place starting this year, and they're moving forward with that. New York, similarly, also, despite the massive increases or costs that they're experiencing associated with COVID-19, also moved forward with their tax relief reforms. And we know that there's also going to be a push among business communities in particular at the state level to provide additional level of tax cuts and relief to businesses. So this is something to be wary of at this moment when states have larger sort of major services that they're needing to shore up. And then the fourth principle is to build more than sandcastles, right? To not just think of this as an opportunity to put in place an emergency measure, which absolutely needs to be part of the solution. But I think the challenge here, the danger is in thinking that an emergency response on its own will be enough. And if states do put into place like a temporary tax increase, we are recommending that any sort of phasing out of that increase should be tied to economic indicators rather than to some arbitrary time period like this, raise the sales tax by 0.25% for the next 2 years, at which point it immediately and automatically expires. So those are some broad-based principles. And then we look at, okay, what are the least harmful options for tax increases. This is really going to vary by the makeup, by each state and by the local government, right? It depends on what do they have the authority constitutionally to enact, what is the culture of the state, right? Around, you know, where is there greater resistance around certain kind of taxes versus others? Where is it that states are more likely to have the trust of the public to go along with a tax increase? So those are all really important factors for advocates who are on the ground actually advancing proposals or trying to fight against other proposals for tax increases to consider. At this point, I'm really going to speak from just sort of a purely policy perspective. What are the best revenue raising options available for folks to raise revenues that will help address the budget shortfalls and then do so in an equitable way that mitigates the overall regressivity of state and local tax systems, driven primarily by reliance on sales taxes. So, the income tax. If you have a state or locality with a personal income tax, some of the levers that are available to you include raising the rates just on the upper income tax brackets, raising the marginal tax rates. There are ways to progressively reform the existing rate brackets. So for example, some states have their highest marginal rates apply at very low levels of taxable income, and depending, you know, through a combination of spreading out those brackets and then differentiating in the rates, you can achieve not only net revenue increases, but concentrated on those with sort of the most resources, you know, within a state. Some other things that are options include high income surcharges or surtaxes. This is a technical thing, but a surtax is a tax on tax, right? So after tax liability is calculated, say someone, you know, has $1,000 in tax liability, a surtax would be a percentage tax that applies to that total amount of tax liability and could be means tested, meaning it only applies to individuals at higher levels of income. For states who have income taxes but are limited to flat income taxes, there are still ways that they can raise revenue progressively, and that includes coupling a rate increase with an offset, such as increasing an earned income tax credit or offering a universal or a means-tested refundable credit that will help offset the impact of that rate increase for individuals in the bottom 80%, bottom 60%, bottom 40% of the income spectrum. This is now also a time for states to really look at what are the tax subsidies that they have right now that are costly and are poorly targeted and may not even be fulfilling their ultimate policy goals. There's lots of loopholes that can be closed that broaden the bases of corporate income taxes, of personal income taxes, which allow for any marginal rate increase to yield even more tax increase than a rate increase performed on a smaller base. We also think that this is an interesting moment for states that don't have income taxes and have a lot of aversion to income taxes to think about maybe there's a role for income taxes in their tax policy basis. I'm not a Pollyanna, don't worry, I don't really think it's gonna happen, but you can make the case, right? Given the pain that Florida is in, the pain that Nevada will be in, the pain that Washington State will be in, it's a really important moment when the immediate sort of crisis moment passes to reflect on what we've learned about some of the challenges and dangers that tax bases that are much more limited and don't include income taxes, what the costs of those are. Within the corporate income tax, again, revisiting subsidies, loopholes, closing those off, broadening the base. Corporate income taxes have been declining over the last 3 decades, and we think it's appropriate for corporate entities to be, just generally speaking, even not in a time of crisis, to be paying more of their fair share. There's also the opportunity to apply this surtax idea to corporate net profits. And there's also important base broadening that can be thought of in terms of combined reporting, including worldwide combined reporting, as well as looking at the apportionment formulas that are used within a state. We have seen over the last several years almost an unstoppable shift to single sales factor as away from a three-factor apportionment formula for corporate income, which has led to a couple of issues, all of which results in lower corporate income taxes. It yields lost income. There's opportunities for tax avoidance. So these are opportunities that both create a stronger corporate income tax base overall and will yield more revenue as well. And then for states that don't have a minimum tax, enacting a minimum tax for corporate profits or for S corporations is another way that they can bring in revenue. These factors alone, particularly in the corporate income tax world, are not going to by themselves fill the kinds of holes that we're speaking of. So the smaller the tax base, the smaller the potential yield from any of these individual tax changes. So states looking at closing significant holes are also looking at possibly needing to address multiple revenue raising options across different tax types. Other progressive revenue raising options include, or these are not progressive, but less regressive, include modernizing sales tax bases. So in a lot of the work that we're doing right now, we're able to show states the difference between filling a 10% loss in their general revenue fund by just raising their sales tax rate versus expanding their sales tax base to personal services, excluding business-to-business transactions, and the difference is really stark. For example, in the state of Michigan, we were doing this analysis, and we showed that in just raising the rate to meet a 10% shortfall, or to fill a 10% shortfall, they would have to raise their general sales tax rate by over like 1.3 cents. And, but if they were to broaden their base to include personal services, they could actually drop the general sales tax rate to 5.32, down from 6%. So this is also a really important moment, even if the sales taxes are having to be relied on to raise revenue, to make the point and to drill home the point with lawmakers and with even the public as necessary, the importance of broadening those sales tax bases in states where that's a constitutional possibility. Some states have not yet, post-Wayfair, allowed their states to collect sales taxes from online sales, and others have not, similarly, have not made those requirements of large online marketplaces. Those are some base broadening opportunities as well that limits the amount by which a rate increase needs to happen to raise a targeted amount of revenue. A lot of states have really out-of-date excise taxes. Gas taxes, for example, Arizona has not updated their gas tax since 1990. It'll be 30 years on October 1st of this year. Which means they have lost just an incredible amount of buying power for infrastructure spending over time, which we know results often in states having to shift more and more of their general funds spending into supporting infrastructure projects. So this is an important, increasing gas taxes is an important opportunity in states where that's relevant and timely. And again, the regressive impact of those increases can be offset through increases to an earned income tax credit or through the enactment of sales tax credit that's means tested and targeted for low and moderate income families. And as we've already talked about, halting or reversing recent tax cuts is an important source of potential revenue. And as is in the CARES Act, there were some federal tax changes that were made, and because of the ways that some states conform to the Internal Revenue Code and their conformity rules, there are states that are going to be experiencing some revenue losses from those tax cuts that were enacted, including changes to the loss limit, as an example, and they could stop some of those losses by decoupling from those changes. So least you think I am really crazy in thinking that states would raise taxes. I just want to let you know that we know that in the aftermath of the Great Recession, 33 states ultimately included tax raising along with cutting revenue as part of how they responded to the downturn. So 10 states in particular raised them to a very significant degree, right? They were able to stave off massive budget cuts, largely in states like California, Florida, New Hampshire, North Carolina, Oregon. So there is a precedence of states turning to this as an option. And then we know when we look at previous recessions, so in the early 90s, there were 44 states that raised taxes. And in the dot-com era, there were more than 30 states that did so as well. So I think it's very likely that in the coming months and years, we're going to see more and more states turning to tax increases as part of how they're going to get some level of stability in their spending and their budgets. In terms of timing is when we can expect to see these conversations, when they might be enacted. We track the news pretty carefully around what's happening in the states. Obviously, there's been a slowdown in a lot of legislative activity because of the actual physical constraints associated with responding to the health concerns. But we have already seen a couple of states talking about and localities talking about revenue raising as part of their strategies. So New Jersey governor, for example, has put forward legislation to borrow, but to guarantee those monies through sales tax increases down the line. We also have seen recently that the city of Philadelphia has put forward a plan and a revised budget that includes increasing their taxes. And we expect to see more of this from more states as we move forward.
Thank you, Lisa. That was an amazing presentation, and I would just like to suggest to the audience members that the ITEP website is a wealth of information about all 50 states plus Washington, D.C., with a deep dive into each state's current structure and tips and traps for the unwary on how these states can be less regressive and be more progressive, and what states have done over the last several years. So please don't hesitate. Many of you are thinking about how states can respond to this. And that website, as well as the websites for Urban Institute, Tax Policy Center, and Brookings, are just a wealth of information. Now, one question that keeps coming up again and again, and it's because it's a response to the exchange we're seeing in Congress, is what about declaring bankruptcy? So as I think this presentation has indicated again and again, really it's the federal government and federalism that have to step up to this unprecedented. I mean, it was really striking, Lisa, to see the comparative analysis with the Great Recession, the 2001 recession, to what's going on and what is anticipated to happen now. It's just shocking, truly. So I'd love to hear each of your thoughts on this, let them declare bankruptcy.
I don't think my thoughts are appropriate for a recorded ABA webinar.
So my thoughts.
So my colleague, Richard O'Shear, wrote a a pretty nice blog on this at the TaxFox blog. And the summary points are just, it's not even clear states can declare bankruptcy. They're not in the Chapter 11 sort of framework. And even if they could, it's not clear how that actually helps them help the people and in their state and move forward. It's not that they're trying to resolve like a debt that they just can't pay. It's they have no money coming in to provide services that they need to get out the door.
Many of which are constitutionally required that they pay for, right? You think about the consent decrees, you think about any other, number of state spending that's actually, legally mandated. It's absurd in a lot of ways.
I mean, I would just add, and I think Elaine alluded to this, fundamentally bankruptcy is a tool to deal with excessive indebtedness. And, to Elaine's point about states having balanced budget requirements, that's not the problem states are facing. They're facing a sudden drop in their revenues, not crippling debt service obligations.
Excellent, thank you. Let's see, on Lisa's chart comparing COVID and the Great Recession, was the steepest revenue drop forecast in 2021?
Yes, I believe that's right. So it's because, and part of that's because, it's the first full year of the impact. So yes, it was 21. That's where it was showing around $350 billion compared to 110 in this fiscal year and 190 in the subsequent 2022.
I think it's possible that the final quarter of fiscal 20 will be pretty ugly. So because but I think it's absolutely the case that fiscal 2021 as a full fiscal year is going to be a lot worse.
Great, thank you. So what is interesting to think about, again, is the role of the federal government and the state governments and how they need to work together, especially in a unprecedented worldwide disaster. And the government, as Matthew and Elaine and Lisa have all weighed in, needs to step in to coordinate a response. And as Matthew has said pretty emphatically, that it's push out as much money to the states and to individuals to try to mitigate the spiral effect of exacerbating layoffs and unemployment and healthcare issues as well. So what is also interesting when we think about state tax systems, as ITEP has monetized, are almost uniformly regressive. And in fact, I think there are just a few states, Lisa, that are not regressive. And when we overlay the very regressive state tax systems with the federal tax system, so the federal tax system tends to be progressive, but when you overlay the very regressive state tax systems, we end up with a much less progressive overall system, which when we have a worldwide disaster like this just exacerbates the problem. So the states that are relying on sales tax are of course crippled by this downturn.
Right, yeah, I mean, it's, obviously, tax fairness is not the first order priority at the moment, right, in a moment of crisis, but it's absolutely the case that these sorts of crisis moments illustrate the ramifications of building your tax base on a regressive source and relying so heavily on a non-diversified portfolio of revenue, right? It's not an investment strategy that many of us would individually incorporate into our own sort of investment strategies. And we know that in terms of the performance of revenues for a state, like over the long haul, you know, states that are more heavily relying on income taxes, and they have a mix of major revenue sources, are performing better, even if in sort of moments like there's higher volatility of an income tax, right? So it's definitely an important moment to reflect and think about the implications of the choices. And as we're thinking about who are the individuals right now that are suffering the most from the health crisis itself, right? Who is most at risk of having lost their job or having to keep working and face higher exposures to the virus, right? Many of these individuals are already the same folks who are paying a higher share of their incomes in state and local taxes because of the regressive systems that our state and local governments have chosen to fund themselves. There are also the individuals who are going to be most vulnerable to losing core supports to keep them above water if and when critical government services are cut, you know, whether that's childcare, whether that's food supports, you know, and so there's just, it's like a triple whammy to then, you know, looking at how states then respond to this moment to say, well, we're gonna have to raise revenue and the only tool we have available is a way that's gonna zing you even harder than those who are in a much better economic position and whom we favor from a tax perspective, even in good times.
I think it's important to note that it wasn't like walking into this, everyone was just doing fine. And so there was a little bit more money, you know, to grab at all levels. We have a situation before any of this hit where 4 in 10 families with kids are saying they're food insecure at some point in the year. Incomes are extremely volatile. They're bouncing around, especially if you're low income. Rent is out of the park for so many people. And so we had a lot of vulnerability before any of this hit. And so to think that there's a group or some amount of cash that's sitting in the bottom that can now be used to dig out is just not realistic.
Absolutely. And when we think about the Tax Cut and Jobs Act that really exacerbated existing income inequality, and now we are really seeing an effect almost of steroids on that same issue. So we have just a few minutes left. I'd love to hear Matthew, any last thoughts? A pearl of wisdom to leave with our audience?
So the one thing, you know, picking up on this theme about sort of, you know, long-term problems that are going to need long-term solutions, I do think looking ahead, you know, every time a recession hits, there's a scramble to provide fiscal relief to states, and what we've done in the past has not ended up being adequate. I think there would be real value this time around if we create mechanisms to provide fiscal relief to states and we tie those mechanisms to economic conditions. Congress should make them permanent. There is no reason that we should have to solve this problem anew with every new recession, and there will inevitably be another recession. So we might as well take this opportunity to get, in addition to solving this problem, to get ready for that one.
Absolutely. Elaine and Lisa, one more pearl of wisdom, and then we'll applaud all of you.
So my parting thoughts is just that states are in a world of trouble. They did not create this trouble themselves, and they cannot bail themselves out. And so I just really encourage people to, you know, not think of this as which states are the hardest hit, but that as a group, states are exposed as vulnerable. And so we ought to be thinking about solutions for all of them.
Lisa, one last word.
These were great thoughts. I would say one other thing. I mean, this moment, maybe in the crisis, there's an opportunity. I know that it's really easy as just an individual to take for granted what it is that states do and the infrastructure that they provide. And there are lots of ways that we as taxpayers, as citizens, don't really see or understand or tangibly interact with the state government in a way. So I think there's also an opportunity to really highlight the positive value and the core services that state governments play, particularly where we see state governments really being the leaders right now in taking on the health crisis, right? So this is really an opportunity to say, to reinforce the importance of what state government does, and that state government is not some separate entity, but it really is a way to provide really core public goods and services that solve a lot of economic problems and ideally make our lives better off and can help respond to crises when they arise.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for joining the ABA section, Civil Rights and Social Justice, for this free webinar. And by the way, I'm very proud of Civil Rights and Social Justice for making all of its COVID-19 webinars free, not only to members, but to anyone. We also like to express our gratitude to this amazing group of panelists. As I indicated when we opened, they are the top critical thinkers on the front line. And I know everybody is feeling very nervous and worried, but I'm telling you, as we all know, there are helpers out there. And these are three amazing critical thinkers with wonderful institutions behind them that are on the front lines of justice. Thank you for taking time out of your schedule to share your experiences. The section provides free webinars and resources for legal professionals and advocates nationwide. We hope that this helps you in your work. And again, if you can please consider joining the ABA Civil Rights and Social Justice section, become active. We need you. We need you now. And we need your dollars now. So please do give generously. You can do so at the website americanbar.org/CRSJ. We also hope you consider supporting the work with a charitable gift and advance human rights, civil liberties, and social justice. You can find information on other free programs on the website, and best of luck in your work, and everyone stay safe. We'll see you again. Thank you so much for joining us.
Bye all, take care, stay safe.
Thank you all.